Witness the rise and fall of notorious gangster Al Capone. From lavish wealth to ultimate downfall. Experience the gripping story of America's most infamous crime lord in this documentary series. Welcome to the Untold Stories of Al Capone, a documentary series that delves into the lesser-known aspects of the infamous gangster's life. From his involvement in labor unions to his experiences in prison, we'll explore the stories that have been overlooked in favor of his more notorious crimes. Let's start with the early years of Al Capone's life and career, a period marked by poverty, violence, and a desire for power. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, Gabrielle and Teresa Capone. He was the fourth of 9 children, and his family struggled to make ends meet. Capone's early life was marked by a troubled relationship with his father, who was a barber and a heavy drinker. This tumultuous home life would later influence Capone's decision to join the underworld. As a young man, Capone became involved in various labor unions, including the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. This involvement would later serve him well in his organized crime career, as he was able to use his connections to intimidate and coerce workers into joining his ranks. Capone's involvement in labor unions also introduced him to the world of organized crime, where he quickly made a name for himself as a ruthless and cunning operator. In the early 1920s, Capone spent several years in Canada, where he became involved in bootlegging and other illicit activities. Little is known about this period of his life, but it's believed that he used his connections in the labor unions to smuggle liquor into the United States. Capone's time in Canada also saw him become involved in a series of violent confrontations with rival gangsters, which would later earn him a reputation as one of the most feared men in the underworld. Capone's time in Canada is a bit of a mystery, but it's likely that he used this period to build his network of underworld contacts and to develop his skills as a bootlegger. Capone's involvement in Canadian organized crime also saw him become acquainted with the notorious gangster, Johnny Torrio, who would later become a mentor and a rival. Capone's rise to power was not without its challenges. He had to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries with other gangsters, including Johnny Torrio and Meyer Lansky. Capone's relationships with these gangsters were key to his success, as he was able to use his connections to build a vast network of underworld contacts and to eliminate his rivals. Capone's relationships with other gangsters were instrumental in his rise to power. He was able to use his connections to Johnny Torrio, for example, to gain access to the Chicago underworld and to establish himself as a major player in the city's organized crime scene. Capone's personal life is often overlooked in favor of his crime stories, but the women in his life played a significant role in shaping his personality and motivations. Capone's wife, May, was a strong influence on him, and he was deeply devoted to her. However, he also had a number of mistresses, including Floria Showgirl Schwartz, who would later become a key witness in his trial. Capone's relationships with women were complex and multifaceted. He was a charming and charismatic figure, and he was able to use his charm to manipulate the women in his life. However, he was also fiercely loyal to those he cared about, and he would stop at nothing to protect them. Capone's connections to Chicago politicians and law enforcement are well documented, but there may be more to the story. Investigating his involvement in local politics could reveal some surprising information. Capone's influence on Chicago politics was significant, as he was able to use his connections to bribe officials and to intimidate his enemies. Capone's influence on Chicago politics was vast and far-reaching. He was able to use his connections to the mayor's office, for example, to secure lucrative contracts and to protect his business interests. However, his influence also extended to the state and federal levels, as he was able to use his connections to the governor's office and to the U.S. Attorney's office to secure favors and to avoid prosecution. Estimates of Capone's wealth vary widely, but some sources suggest that he may have amassed a fortune of over 100 million. Exploring the extent of his wealth and how he managed to accumulate it could be a fascinating story. Capone's wealth was staggering, as he was able to use his connections in the underworld to amass a vast fortune, which he then used to invest in legitimate businesses and to bribe officials. In 1931, Capone was indicted on charges of tax evasion, and his trial was widely publicized. The trial was a dramatic spectacle, with Capone's lawyers arguing that he was a legitimate businessman and the prosecution arguing that he was a ruthless gangster. The prosecution presented evidence of Capone's lavish spending and his failure to pay taxes on his income, while Capone's lawyers argued that he was being unfairly targeted by the government. Capone's trial was a turning point in his life, as it marked the beginning of the end of his reign as a powerful gangster. The trial also marked a shift in public opinion, as people began to see Capone as a symbol of organized crime rather than a charming and charismatic figure. The trial was a major media event, with reporters and photographers swarming the courtroom to catch a glimpse of the infamous gangster. The trial was a tense and dramatic affair, with Capone's lawyers and the prosecution engaging in a series of heated exchanges. In the end, the jury delivered a guilty verdict, and Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The sentence was a major blow to Capone, who had always managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The trial was a landmark case in the history of organized crime, as it marked the first time that a major gangster had been convicted of a serious crime. The trial also set a precedent for future prosecutions of organized crime figures, and it paved the way for the eventual downfall of the Chicago outfit. Capone's time in prison was marked by a series of appeals and attempts to reduce his sentence. He was eventually transferred to the federal prison in Alcatraz, where he spent several years in solitary confinement. Despite his isolation, Capone continued to exert influence over the underworld, and his reputation as a ruthless gangster continued to grow. Capone's time in prison was marked by a series of conflicts with prison authorities, who were determined to break his spirit and undermine his influence. Despite these efforts, Capone remained a powerful figure in the underworld, and his reputation as a ruthless gangster continued to intimidate and fascinate the public. Capone's prison cell was a small, Spartan affair, with a narrow bed and a small desk. Despite the austere surroundings, Capone was able to maintain a sense of luxury and comfort, thanks to the bribes and favors that he was able to secure from the prison authorities. After his release from prison, Capone retired to his home in Florida, where he lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Despite his decline, Capone's legacy as a gangster and a symbol of organized crime continued to endure. He remains one of the most fascinating and infamous figures in American history, and his story continues to captivate audiences to this day. Capone's later life was marked by a series of health problems, including syphilis and heart disease. Despite these challenges, he remained a charismatic and complex figure, and his legacy as a gangster and a symbol of organized crime continues to fascinate audiences today. Capone died in 1947, at the age of 48. His funeral was a major media event, with reporters and photographers swarming the streets to catch a glimpse of the infamous gangster. Despite the controversy surrounding his life and death, Capone remains a fascinating and complex figure, and his legacy continues to captivate audiences to this day. And so we come to the end of our story of Al Capone, a man who was both a ruthless gangster and a fascinating figure. His life was marked by violence, crime, and corruption, but it was also marked by charisma, charm, and a deep sense of loyalty to those he cared about. Whether you see him as a hero or a villain, Al Capone remains one of the most fascinating figures in American history, and his story continues to captivate us to this day. If you've enjoyed this documentary about Al Capone, we encourage you to explore more about his life and legacy. Check out our channel for additional resources and insights.